The blueprint revisions for the downtown office complex covered my kitchen table. Red ink corrections marking structural modifications that would save the client $2 million in construction costs. I finished calculating the load-bearing adjustments for the 32nd floor, cross-referencing wind load specifications against the updated foundation design, when 3 sharp knocks echoed through my apartment. I'm Victoria Nash, and for the past 14 years, I've been a structural engineer specializing in high-rise construction. My consulting firm, Nash Engineering Solutions, has designed earthquake-resistant frameworks for buildings across the West Coast, including the 70-story tower that now dominated the city skyline 10 blocks from my apartment. But most people who knew me casually, including my landlord, thought I was just a tenant who worked from home doing computer stuff. The knocking continued, more insistent now. I glanced at the clock, 8:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening. Not typical timing for maintenance issues or neighborly visits. I saved my work, closed the laptop, and walked to the front door. Through the peephole, I could see Harold Brennan, my landlord for the past 3 years, flanked by 2 men in dark suits who looked distinctly uncomfortable. Harold's usual rumpled appearance had been upgraded to what appeared to be a new jacket and tie, though the effect was somewhat undermined by his perpetually anxious expression. I opened the door, maintaining the polite but distant relationship we'd established since I'd moved into the Meridian Towers apartment complex. "Good evening, Harold. Is everything all right?" He shifted nervously, clearly rehearsing whatever speech he prepared. "Victoria, I need to discuss some changes to your lease agreement. May we come in?" The 2 men behind him said nothing, but their presence was obviously meant to convey authority or intimidation. I stepped aside to let them enter, curious about what had prompted this unusual evening visit. My apartment was spacious by city standards, 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district. I'd chosen it specifically for the home office potential and the structural integrity of the building itself, having reviewed the original architectural plans before signing the lease. The rent was reasonable for the location, and Harold had been a hands-off landlord who generally avoided tenant interactions. "Can I offer anyone coffee or water?" I asked, gesturing toward the living room furniture. Harold declined, but one of his companions, a thin man with calculating eyes, surveyed my apartment with obvious assessment. He noted the expensive computer equipment, the engineering texts on the bookshelves, and the framed certificates from various professional organizations. "Victoria," Harold began, his voice carrying a forced confidence that didn't match his body language. "The real estate market has changed significantly since you signed your current lease. Property values in this area have increased dramatically." I nodded politely. Market appreciation was hardly news in a city where tech growth had been driving construction booms for years. My own projects had contributed to that growth, though Harold had no idea about the scope of my professional involvement in the district's development. "I understand market conditions can affect property values," I replied. "Is this about the lease renewal negotiations? I thought we weren't scheduled to discuss that until next month." The thin man stepped forward, clearly the source of Harold's newfound assertiveness. "I'm Gerald Hoffman from Hoffman Property Management. We've been consulting with Mr. Brennan about optimizing his portfolio's revenue potential." Ah, Harold had hired a property management company, probably lured by promises of increased rental income through aggressive tenant management. I'd seen this pattern before. Small landlords getting convinced to sacrifice stable, long-term tenants for short-term profit maximization. "The current rental rates for this building are significantly below market value," Hoffman continued. "We've identified substantial opportunities for revenue enhancement through strategic lease restructuring. Translation: they wanted to force out existing tenants to justify massive rent increases for new ones. It was a common gentrification strategy, though typically implemented with more legal finesse than this evening's intimidation approach. Harold cleared his throat. "Victoria, your rent is increasing to $4,500 per month, effective immediately. If you can't agree to the new terms, we'll need you to vacate by tomorrow morning." I kept my expression neutral while processing the implications. My current rent was $1,500 monthly. They were proposing to triple it overnight. More significantly, they were attempting to implement this change outside normal lease procedures without proper notice or legal justification. "That's quite an increase," I said calmly. "May I see the legal documentation supporting this change?" Hoffman's smile had sharp edges. "Market conditions don't require extensive documentation. You can accept the new terms or find alternative housing. Given the current rental market, I doubt you'll find anything comparable at your previous rate." The second man, who'd remained silent until now, finally spoke. "We've brought security personnel to ensure a smooth transition if you choose the vacation option." Security personnel. They'd brought muscle to intimidate a tenant into accepting illegal rent increases. This was moving from aggressive property management into potential extortion territory. "I appreciate you coming by to discuss this," I said, maintaining my calm tone. "Before I respond, could you give me a few minutes to retrieve some paperwork from my files? I want to review my lease terms and legal options." Harold nodded eagerly, probably assuming I was preparing to negotiate or surrender. Hoffman checked his expensive watch with obvious impatience, while the security contractors positioned themselves near the door like they were preventing an escape attempt. I walked to my home office, closing the door behind me. The filing cabinet in the corner contained the usual tenant documents: lease agreements, rent receipts, correspondence with Harold about maintenance issues. But in the bottom drawer, secured in a fireproof document box, were papers that would fundamentally change the evening's dynamic. I'd purchased the Meridian Towers building 8 months ago through Cascade Holdings, one of several shell companies I used for real estate investments. The acquisition had been part of a larger portfolio purchase involving 6 properties across the downtown district, financed through my engineering firm's substantial profits from recent construction projects. Harold had been struggling with building maintenance costs and falling behind on property tax payments. When Cascade Holdings approached him with a generous offer, he'd accepted immediately, though the sale terms included a management agreement that allowed him to continue operating as landlord while we handled ownership responsibilities behind the scenes. The irony was that Harold had been paying rent to my company for months while simultaneously collecting rent from tenants who had no idea about the ownership change. He'd signed paperwork acknowledging Cascade Holdings as the new owner, but apparently hadn't connected that information to his tenant Victoria Nash's actual identity. I pulled out the deed, property transfer documents, and Harold's signed management agreement. The papers clearly established my ownership of the building Harold was now trying to evict me from, using intimidation tactics that violated both his management contract and basic tenant rights. Returning to the living room, I found Hoffman examining my engineering certificates with obvious confusion. He'd apparently expected to find evidence of financial instability, not professional credentials suggesting substantial earning potential. "These are impressive qualifications," he said, gesturing toward my structural engineering license. "What exactly do you do for work?" "I design buildings," I replied simply, settling into my chair with the document folder. "Now, about this rent increase." Harold leaned forward eagerly. "Have you decided about the new terms?" "I've reviewed my legal position, and I have some concerns about your proposed changes. I opened the folder, placing the first document on the coffee table. This is the deed to the Meridian Towers building, filed with the county recorder's office 8 months ago. All three men leaned forward to examine the document. Harold's expression shifted from confident to confused as he read the property details. Hoffman's sharp smile faded as he processed the legal language. According to this deed, I continued, the building owner is Cascade Holdings LLC, which acquired the property from Harold Brennan in a transaction completed last March. Harold nodded slowly. Yes, that's correct. I sold to Cascade, but retained management responsibilities under a service agreement. Excellent. Then you'll recognize this document. I placed the management agreement on the table. Your contract with Cascade Holdings, specifying your duties as property manager and the limitations on your authority. Hoffman snatched up the agreement, scanning the text with growing alarm. The contract clearly outlined Harold's responsibilities and explicitly prohibited arbitrary rent increases without owner approval. Harold, I said gently, according to Section 12 of your management agreement, any rent adjustments require written approval from Cascade Holdings' authorized representative. Did you obtain that approval before tonight's visit? His face had gone pale. No, I thought. Hoffman said market conditions aloud. Market conditions don't override legal contracts, I continued. More importantly, Section 15 prohibits intimidation tactics against tenants, including threats of immediate eviction without proper legal notice. I placed the final document on the table. This is Cascade Holdings' Articles of Incorporation, filed with the state. You'll notice the authorized representative's signature matches mine. The silence that followed was profound. Harold stared at the documents, slowly connecting pieces he'd somehow missed despite signing them months earlier. Hoffman looked like he was calculating how quickly he could distance himself from the evening's activities. Your Cascade Holdings? Harold whispered. I'm the principal owner, yes, which makes me both your tenant and your boss, Harold. Though after tonight's performance, we need to discuss whether our management arrangement should continue. The security contractors had stepped back toward the door, clearly recognizing that their services were no longer required or welcome. Hoffman was examining his phone, probably searching for exit strategies that didn't involve legal liability. This is impossible, Hoffman protested. Property owners don't rent apartments in their own buildings. Why not? I wanted to live downtown near my work. This building met my requirements, and the apartment was vacant when I moved in. The fact that I later purchased the building doesn't invalidate my tenancy. I stood up, gathering the documents. Harold, your management contract included provisions for situations like this. Tomorrow morning, I'll need you to provide a written report explaining tonight's attempted rent increase and the rationale for bringing security personnel to intimidate a tenant. Victoria, I had no idea. That's precisely the problem. You had no idea who you were dealing with, what legal authority you actually possessed, or what consequences your actions might have. Hoffman finally found his voice. This whole situation is highly irregular. Property owners have rights that supersede tenant protections. Property owners have responsibilities that include following their own management contracts and respecting tenant rights, neither of which happened tonight. I walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline where several buildings bore my engineering signature. The irony of the evening wasn't lost on me. I designed earthquake-resistant structures that could withstand natural disasters, but apparently hadn't protected myself against landlord stupidity. Gentlemen, I think this meeting is concluded. Harold, please review our management agreement tonight and call me tomorrow morning to discuss how we prevent similar misunderstandings. Hoffman was already heading for the door, his property management services apparently no longer required. The security contractors followed without a word, probably relieved to escape what had become a legally complicated situation. Harold lingered, looking genuinely distressed. "Victoria, I'm sorry. Hoffman convinced me that aggressive management would maximize property values. I never intended to create problems for good tenants." "Harold, you've been managing this building for 3 years. In that time, have I ever been late with rent? Have I caused property damage or tenant complaints?" "No, never. You've been an ideal tenant." "Then why would you risk losing me for a theoretical rent increase that might not even be sustainable in the current market?" He sat down heavily on my couch. "Because I've been struggling financially. The building maintenance costs, property taxes, insurance, it's been overwhelming." When Hoffman showed me revenue projections with higher rental rates, it seemed like the solution to all my problems. I understood his financial pressures better than he realized. The property acquisition paperwork had revealed Harold's debts, deferred maintenance issues, and mounting expenses that had motivated the sale. But attacking stable tenants wasn't the solution to building management challenges. "Harold, financial problems require sustainable solutions, not quick fixes that alienate tenants and potentially expose you to legal liability." Over the following hour, we discussed the building's actual financial situation. Harold's management approach had been reactive rather than strategic, addressing problems as they arose instead of planning for long-term sustainability. Higher rental income was indeed possible, but through unit improvements and strategic marketing rather than intimidation tactics. "What happens now?" Harold asked as our conversation wound down. "Now you continue managing the building under our existing agreement, but with better understanding of your actual authority and responsibilities. Cascade Holdings will also provide additional resources for property improvements that justify gradual rent increases through normal lease renewal processes and the Hoffman property management contract. I'd recommend terminating that immediately. Their approach creates legal liability without providing sustainable value." A week later, I sat in my apartment reviewing engineering plans while Harold knocked on my door again, this time alone, during normal business hours, and with a much more professional demeanor. "Victoria, I wanted to update you on the building improvements we discussed." I invited him in, noting his more relaxed appearance. The stress that had driven him to desperate measures seemed considerably reduced. "The property management contract with Hoffman has been terminated," he reported. "I've also scheduled consultations with contractors about the lobby renovation and elevator modernization projects." "Excellent. How are the other tenants responding to the improvement announcements?" "Very positively. Several have expressed interest in lease extensions once the upgrades are completed. No one's mentioned the awkward visit last week." I hadn't shared details about our unusual landlord-tenant-owner relationship with other building residents. Harold's learning experience didn't need to become neighborhood gossip. "Harold, I have a proposal that might interest you. Cascade Holdings has been considering property management expansion, and your building experience could be valuable for our other holdings." His eyes lit up with genuine interest. "What kind of expansion?" "We've acquired properties throughout the district that need experienced local management. The compensation would be significantly better than your current arrangement, and you'd have proper company support instead of operating independently." Over the next month, Harold transitioned from struggling individual landlord to regional property manager for Cascade Holdings' real estate portfolio. His intimate knowledge of building maintenance, combined with proper financial backing and legal support, transformed him into an effective property management professional. The Meridian Towers building underwent systematic improvements that justified gradual rent increases for new tenants while maintaining affordable rates for existing residents who had been stable, responsible occupants. My own rent remained unchanged, though I occasionally received building improvement updates from Harold in his capacity as property manager rather than landlord. 6 months after the confrontation that had started our complex relationship, Harold stopped by my apartment with coffee and the building's quarterly financial reports. "Victoria, I wanted to thank you for not firing me immediately after that disastrous evening with Hoffman. Everyone deserves the chance to learn from mistakes, provided they actually learn. I've been thinking about what would have happened if you'd been a normal tenant facing that kind of intimidation. Someone without legal resources or financial stability. It would have been devastating. Forced relocation, legal costs, potential job disruption. Exactly the kind of situation tenant protection laws are designed to prevent." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "I've implemented new procedures for all the Cascade properties. No rent adjustments without proper legal review, no intimidation tactics, and mandatory mediation for tenant disputes before considering eviction procedures." "How are the other property managers responding to the new protocols?" "Better than expected. It turns out that treating tenants with respect actually reduces management headaches and legal liability." "Who would have guessed?" We both laughed, recognizing the irony that basic human decency also happened to be good business practice. A year after the incident, I was reviewing architectural plans for a new downtown development when Harold called with an unusual request. "Victoria, I have a potential tenant for the penthouse unit who specifically asked about meeting the building owner. Apparently, they've heard about our management approach and want to discuss a long-term lease directly." "That's interesting. What type of tenant?" "A federal judge who's relocating to the city. She's been dealing with landlord issues in her current location and wants assurance about building stability and management practices." I agreed to meet with Judge Patricia Connors, curious about her specific concerns. The conversation revealed that she'd been researching downtown properties and had identified Meridian Towers as having unusually stable management and satisfied tenants. "I've seen too many landlord-tenant conflicts in my courtroom," Judge Connors explained. "Properties with ethical management practices are increasingly rare, and I'm willing to pay premium rent for peace of mind." "What convinced you that this building met your requirements?" "Tenant reviews consistently mentioned respectful management, prompt maintenance response, and transparent communication. Several residents specifically noted that they'd never experienced intimidation or arbitrary policy changes." Harold beamed with pride. The transformation from desperate landlord to respected property manager had clearly exceeded his own expectations. "Judge Connors," I said, "you'll find that our management approach prioritizes long-term tenant satisfaction over short-term profit maximization. We've learned that stable, respected tenants create more value than aggressive rent extraction." That's refreshing to hear from a property owner. After Judge Connors signed a 5-year lease for the penthouse, Harold and I reflected on how dramatically our building's reputation had improved. "You know," Harold said, "that night when I showed up with Hoffman and those security guards was the worst mistake I've ever made as a landlord." "And the best learning experience?" "Absolutely. I went from treating tenants as profit sources to recognizing them as community members whose satisfaction directly affects property value." "Harold, would you be interested in speaking at the Property Management Association's annual conference? Your experience could help other landlords avoid similar mistakes." He looked genuinely surprised. "You think other property managers would be interested in my story?" I think they'd benefit from understanding how ethical management practices create sustainable profits while aggressive tactics create legal liability and tenant turnover. 6 months later, Harold delivered a presentation titled From Intimidation to Integration: Building Value Through Tenant Respect to over 300 property management professionals. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with several management companies requesting consulting services about implementing similar approaches. The presentation also caught attention from the City Council's Housing Committee, which invited Harold to participate in developing new landlord-tenant mediation programs designed to prevent aggressive eviction tactics. Victoria, Harold said after his first committee meeting, they want to use our building as a model for ethical property management practices. How do you feel about that level of public attention? Honestly, proud. 3 years ago, I was a struggling landlord making terrible decisions out of desperation. Now I'm helping develop policy solutions that protect both tenants and property owners. The committee work led to Harold being appointed to the city's Affordable Housing Task Force, where his combination of property management experience and tenant advocacy perspective provided valuable insight for policy development. It's ironic, he reflected during one of our quarterly building reviews. The night I tried to intimidate you into accepting illegal rent increases was the beginning of the most successful period of my career. Sometimes the biggest disasters become the most important learning opportunities. Though I still can't believe I brought security guards to threaten someone who owned the building. We both laughed, recognizing that the evening had been simultaneously Harold's worst decision and the catalyst for dramatic positive change in his professional approach and personal values. 2 years after our initial confrontation, Meridian Towers had become one of the city's most sought-after residential properties, with a waiting list for available units and rent rates that reflected quality rather than exploitation. Harold's management company had expanded to oversee 40 properties throughout the region, all operating under the ethical principles he developed through our unlikely partnership. Victoria, Harold said during our latest quarterly meeting, I have a confession. What's that? For the first 6 months after I learned you owned the building, I was terrified you were going to evict me as property manager. Why would I do that? Because I demonstrated such poor judgment and created legal liability for your company. I smiled, thinking about the journey we both traveled from that disastrous evening to our current successful collaboration. Harold, the best property managers are the ones who learn from mistakes, rather than repeating them. You've proven that ethical management isn't just morally right, it's also more profitable and sustainable than aggressive tactics. And you've proven that property owners can prioritize tenant welfare without sacrificing business success. Sometimes the most effective way to protect your investment is to treat people with respect and dignity, regardless of the power dynamics involved. Looking back, the evening when Harold showed up with security guards demanding triple rent was a perfect example of how assumptions can create catastrophic miscalculations. He'd assumed I was a financially vulnerable tenant who could be intimidated into accepting illegal demands. I'd assumed my role, as both tenant and owner, would remain comfortably separate. Both assumptions were wrong, but the collision between them created something better than either of us had imagined. A property management approach that demonstrated how ethical business practices could generate superior results while treating everyone involved with respect and dignity. Sometimes the best outcomes emerge from the most uncomfortable confrontations, provided everyone involved is willing to learn from the experience, rather than simply defending their initial positions. Mrs. Chen, your foundation's quarterly report needs your signature before Monday's board meeting. I looked up from the stack of grant applications covering my office desk, accepting the leather portfolio from my assistant David. The Chen Foundation had processed over 200 funding requests this month alone. Everything from pediatric cancer research to arts education programs. Each application represented someone's hope for positive change, and I took that responsibility seriously. Thank you, David. Any urgent items that can't wait until after the weekend? He consulted his tablet, scrolling through the carefully organized schedule that kept my philanthropic work running smoothly. The Children's Hospital called about the new wing groundbreaking ceremony. They want to confirm your availability for the dedication speech next month. I signed the quarterly report, noting the foundation's assets had grown another 12% this quarter. Conservative investments and strategic partnerships had built our endowment from my initial $20 million commitment into something approaching $200 million over the past 8 years. Not bad for someone who'd started with a business degree and determination to make generational wealth mean something beyond luxury purchases. Confirm the dedication. What else? Your mother-in-law called twice about tonight's gala seating arrangements. Something about ensuring proper family representation at the head table. I suppressed a smile. Eleanor Whitman had been micromanaging family appearances since I'd married her son 5 years ago, treating every social event like a strategic military operation. Tonight's Children's Medical Foundation Gala would be no exception, especially since the Whitman family had been prominent supporters for decades. Did she mention anything specific about the arrangements? David's diplomatically neutral expression told me everything. She expressed concern about maintaining appropriate family hierarchy during the speeches. Translation: Eleanor didn't want me sitting too close to the donors who actually mattered. Despite my foundation's significant contributions to various causes, she still saw me as the outsider who'd somehow captured her son's attention without bringing sufficient social pedigree to the marriage. I'll handle it tonight. Anything else requiring immediate attention? The Detroit Project site visit is confirmed for Tuesday, and the Education Initiative presentations are ready for your review. I nodded, gathering the grant applications I'd been reviewing. The Chen Foundation's Education Initiative was my personal passion project, providing scholarships and program funding to underserved communities. This year's budget allocated $40 million specifically for educational equity programs, money that would change hundreds of lives. My phone buzzed with a text from my husband, James. Mom's already at the venue directing setup. Fair warning, she's in full general mode tonight. I replied, understood. See you at 7. James had learned to navigate his mother's social control tendencies by providing advance warnings and strategic absences. He genuinely loved both of us, but had long ago stopped trying to broker peace between Eleanor's traditional expectations and my decidedly non-traditional approach to wealth and influence. The drive to the Meridian Hotel took 30 minutes through downtown traffic, giving me time to review my mental notes about tonight's event. The Children's Medical Foundation raised money for pediatric research and treatment programs, a cause close to my heart since my younger brother's successful leukemia treatment 15 years ago. The foundation's annual gala typically brought in around $3 million, funding that supported groundbreaking research initiatives. I'd been quietly supporting their work for years through both personal donations and foundation grants, but always in ways that didn't draw attention to the amounts involved. Eleanor Whitman thrived on public recognition and carefully orchestrated social positioning. I preferred results over recognition, a philosophical difference that had created tension from the beginning of my relationship with James. The hotel's valet service handled my car efficiently, and I entered the ballroom to find the expected scene of controlled elegance. Crystal chandeliers, perfectly arranged floral centerpieces, round tables seating 10, with a raised platform for the evening speakers and award presentations. The guest list included the city's most prominent philanthropists, medical professionals, and society figures, all dressed in variations of expensive formal wear. Eleanor stood near the registration table, wearing an elegant navy gown and what I'd learned to recognize as her event management expression. She was discussing something with the foundation's executive director, gesturing toward the seating chart with practiced authority. "Isabella, darling," she called when she spotted me. The term darling from Eleanor always carried subtle condescension, as if she were addressing a child who needed gentle correction. "I was just ensuring your seating placement respects the foundation's donor hierarchy." I approached with a warm smile, having learned that genuine pleasantness confused Eleanor more than defensive responses. "Good evening, Eleanor. The decorations look beautiful. I'm sure tonight will be very successful." "Yes. Well, success requires proper planning and appropriate recognition of long-standing supporters." She consulted her seating chart, making small marks with a gold pen. "I've placed you at table 12 with some lovely young couples. I thought you'd be more comfortable with people closer to your own social level." Table 12 was near the back of the room, strategically positioned to be barely visible from the main platform. Eleanor had effectively relegated me to the children's table, despite my foundation's substantial ongoing support for the organization. "That sounds perfect," I said calmly. "I'm sure I'll enjoy the conversation." James appeared beside me, handsome in his black tuxedo and clearly prepared to run interference if necessary. "Mom, Isabella, you both look wonderful. How are the final preparations going?" "Smoothly, thanks to proper advance planning," Eleanor replied, shooting me a meaningful look. "Though some people seem to think charitable work is just about writing checks, rather than understanding the social dynamics involved." The barb was subtle but clear. Eleanor believed I lacked sophistication in my approach to philanthropy, preferring direct action over the elaborate social rituals that sustained her peer group's charitable efforts. "Speaking of checks," James said carefully, "Isabella's foundation has been incredibly generous to pediatric research programs. I saw the quarterly reports, and the funding amounts are really impressive." Eleanor's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. She knew about my foundation, but had never inquired about specifics, preferring to assume it was a small-scale vanity project rather than acknowledge its actual scope and impact. "Of course, dear. New money often tries to make up for lack of heritage through excessive generosity." The comment landed like a slap, though delivered with Eleanor's trademark gracious tone. She just dismissed my family's hard-earned success as new money, while simultaneously criticizing the generosity that had helped fund medical breakthroughs saving children's lives. James tensed beside me, but I maintained my calm expression. "You're absolutely right, Eleanor. Heritage is important, though I find that combining traditional values with contemporary resources often produces the most meaningful results." Before she could respond, the foundation's executive director approached our group with obvious relief at finding Eleanor available for consultation. "Mrs. Whitman, we need your guidance on the auction presentation order. Should we lead with the research equipment or the scholarship fund?" Eleanor immediately turned her attention to event logistics, leaving James and me to find our assigned seats. As we walked through the ballroom, I noticed the careful social geography Eleanor had orchestrated. The head table featured longtime board members and major donors whose families had been supporting the foundation for generations. Tables 2 through 6 held prominent physicians, pharmaceutical executives, and established society figures. My table 12 was populated by younger professionals who probably donated in the hundreds rather than thousands. "I'm sorry about Mom," James said quietly as we reached our table. "She's been stressed about tonight's fundraising goals." "It's fine. I understand the pressure of event management." What I understood was that Eleanor saw me as a threat to her carefully maintained social hierarchy. My foundation's resources exceeded those of most families at the head table, but I'd never demanded recognition or board positions in return for support. That restraint had apparently been interpreted as evidence that my contributions weren't significant enough to warrant serious consideration. Our tablemates were indeed pleasant young professionals. Two couples who worked in medical administration, a pediatric nurse and her husband, and a pharmaceutical researcher with his wife. The conversation flowed easily through topics ranging from treatment innovations to fundraising challenges, with everyone sharing genuine passion for improving children's health care. During the salad course, I noticed Eleanor moving between tables, greeting longtime supporters with warm familiarity while maintaining polite distance from those she considered less established. Her performance was flawless, demonstrating the social skills that had made her a formidable force in philanthropic circles for 30 years. The auction began after dinner, featuring experiences and items donated by local businesses and wealthy supporters. Art pieces, vacation packages, dining experiences, and medical equipment all commanded impressive bids from the assembled guests. Eleanor served as one of the volunteer auctioneers, her practiced charm encouraging competitive bidding that pushed prices well above estimated values. As the auction concluded and the evening speakers approached the podium, Eleanor made her way to my table. She'd consumed at least 3 glasses of wine during dinner, and her usual careful control had relaxed into something approaching honesty. "Isabella, could I speak with you privately?" she asked, though her tone suggested it wasn't really a request. I followed her to a quiet alcove near the hotel bar, away from the main ballroom activity. The space was dimly lit and relatively secluded, perfect for the kind of direct conversation Eleanor had been avoiding for 5 years. "I think it's time we discussed your role in this family," she began, her voice low but intense. "James is a wonderful man from a respected family with deep roots in this community. His future requires careful consideration of social positioning and appropriate partnerships." I remained silent, allowing her to continue. "You seem like a nice enough person, but you'll never fit into this family or our social circle. Your background, your approach to charity, your complete lack of understanding about how these relationships actually work." She gestured toward the ballroom. "Tonight is a perfect example. You sit quietly at the back, contributing nothing to the conversation, while people who've built real influence over decades handle the important work." The words hung in the air between us, years of carefully suppressed disapproval finally spoken aloud. "I appreciate your honesty, Eleanor," I said calmly. "If you'll excuse me for a moment, I need to make a phone call." I walked to the hotel lobby, pulling out my phone to call David. He answered immediately, despite the late hour. "Mrs. Chen, how can I help?" "I need you to process an immediate donation to the Children's Medical Foundation. $5 million from the foundation's discretionary fund. Have the paperwork ready for electronic signature within the next 10 minutes. Certainly, any specific designation for the funding. General operating support. And David, please call the foundation's executive director directly to confirm the donation tonight. I believe they're hoping to announce a funding milestone during the evening's program." "Understood. Anything else?" "That should be sufficient." I returned to the ballroom as the foundation's executive director was approaching the microphone for his closing remarks. Eleanor had resumed her position at the head table, looking satisfied with whatever she believed she'd accomplished during our conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen," the executive director began, "tonight has been an extraordinary success, with auction proceeds exceeding our projected goals by nearly 40%. Polite applause filled the room. But before we conclude, I've just received notification of an additional contribution that brings tonight's total to unprecedented levels. He paused, consulting the note David had apparently delivered. I'm honored to announce a $5 million donation from the Chen Foundation, designated for our general operating support. The applause was no longer polite. It was thunderous, sustained, and accompanied by surprised murmurs as people processed the significance of the announcement. $5 million was more than many of the Foundation's previous annual totals. I remained seated at table 12, maintaining the same calm expression I'd worn all evening. But around me, the social dynamics Eleanor had carefully orchestrated were crumbling in real time. The Foundation's board president approached the microphone next, clearly struggling to manage his excitement. The Chen Foundation's extraordinary generosity represents a transformational moment for our organization. Mrs. Chen, would you please join us on stage to accept our deepest gratitude? Every head in the ballroom turned toward my table. The pediatric nurse beside me gasped softly. The pharmaceutical researcher was staring with obvious shock. From the head table, I could see Eleanor's face, cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror as she realized the implications. I stood slowly, smoothing my dress, and walked through the suddenly silent ballroom toward the stage. The same walk Eleanor had dismissed as insignificant now carried very different weight as 300 prominent citizens processed the revelation that the quiet woman relegated to the back table had just made the largest single donation in the Foundation's history. On stage, the executive director shook my hand warmly while the board president presented me with a crystal award that clearly hadn't been prepared in advance. The applause continued as photographers captured the moment for the Foundation's promotional materials. Mrs. Chen, the executive director said into the microphone, would you like to say a few words about the Chen Foundation's commitment to pediatric healthcare? I accepted the microphone, looking out over the crowd that was now paying very close attention to every word. Thank you for this recognition, though I want to emphasize that tonight's donation represents the collective work of our Foundation's entire team. The Chen Foundation was established to address critical gaps in healthcare access and research funding, particularly for underserved populations. I paused, noticing Eleanor's increasingly pale complexion. Over the past 8 years, we've allocated over $40 million specifically to pediatric research and treatment programs. Tonight's contribution continues that commitment, funding innovative research that will save children's lives for generations to come. The numbers were having their intended effect. $40 million plus tonight's $5 million represented more philanthropic impact than most of the families in attendance had achieved over decades of carefully managed social giving. The Foundation's education initiative has also provided scholarships to over 300 medical students from underrepresented communities, ensuring that the next generation of physicians reflects the diversity of patients they'll serve. I handed the microphone back to the executive director, accepted final congratulations from the board members, and returned to my table through sustained applause. The walk back revealed a completely transformed social landscape. People who'd ignored me all evening now watched with newfound respect. Conversations paused as I passed, with obvious recalculation of social hierarchies occurring in real time. James met me halfway, his expression showing pride, mixed with amazement. He'd known about my Foundation's work, but hadn't fully understood the scale of impact until tonight's public revelation. Isabella, that was incredible. I had no idea about the $40 million in previous funding. Your mother and I had a conversation about family contributions. I thought it might be helpful to clarify the Chen Foundation's level of engagement. As we reached our table, Eleanor appeared beside us, her earlier confidence replaced by barely controlled distress. The carefully orchestrated social evening had become a public demonstration of her complete misunderstanding of family dynamics. "Isabella," she said quietly, "I think we need to continue our conversation. Of course, though perhaps James should join us this time." We found a quiet corner where Eleanor could speak without being overheard by the guests who were now eyeing our family group with obvious curiosity. "I owe you an apology," Eleanor began, her voice strained. "I clearly misunderstood the scope of your charitable work." "You misunderstood several things, Eleanor, but the charitable work was probably the least important." James looked between us, sensing undercurrents he hadn't witnessed directly. "What exactly did you misunderstand, Mom?" Eleanor's composure cracked slightly. "I suggested that Isabella didn't fit into our family or social circle, that her contributions weren't significant enough to warrant serious consideration. You said, I'd never be good enough for this family." I corrected gently. "Those were your exact words." James's expression shifted from confusion to anger as he processed the implications. "Mom, what were you thinking?" "I was thinking about family heritage and social positioning. I didn't realize that Isabella's foundation had achieved such substantial impact." "This isn't about money, Eleanor," I said quietly. "This is about respect, about treating family members with basic courtesy, regardless of their perceived social status." "You're absolutely right. I've been unfair." The admission clearly cost her significant effort, but the evening's revelations had shattered her confidence in her own judgment. Over the following weeks, Eleanor's attitude underwent a dramatic transformation. She began asking informed questions about the Chin Foundation's work, attending board meetings as an observer, and introducing me to her social circle as my daughter-in-law who runs one of the city's most impactful philanthropic organizations. The shift was comprehensive and permanent. Within 3 months, she'd recommended me for positions on 2 hospital boards and a university foundation committee. Her friends, who'd previously treated me with polite dismissiveness, now sought my advice on their own charitable initiatives. But the most significant change was personal. Eleanor began treating me as an intellectual equal rather than a social project requiring correction. Our conversations moved from superficial pleasantries to substantive discussions about healthcare policy, education reform, and strategic philanthropy. 6 months after the gala, Eleanor and I were reviewing grant applications together in my foundation office, collaborating on a new initiative to fund medical research at the Children's Hospital. "I had been thinking about that night," she said, setting down a scholarship application, "about how wrong I was about everything." "You weren't wrong about everything, just about some important assumptions. I assumed that generosity required recognition, that impact required social positioning, that family status could be measured by how closely someone conformed to established patterns. I looked up from the research proposal I'd been reviewing, and now I realize that real influence comes from actual results, not social performance. That my daughter-in-law has accomplished more meaningful change in 8 years than I managed in 30. We've accomplished different things, Eleanor. Your social connections have opened doors that made our collaboration possible. Perhaps. But I spent decades focused on maintaining position while you built something that actually improves lives." The relationship between Eleanor and me had evolved into genuine partnership, built on mutual respect rather than social obligation. James often commented that family dinners had become more interesting once his mother and wife started sharing ideas instead of navigating carefully around unspoken tensions. A year after the charity gala, Eleanor approached me with a proposal that would have seemed impossible during our first difficult conversation. "I'd like to establish a legacy fund," she said over coffee in my office. "Something that combines the Whitman family's long-term community connections with the Chen Foundation's strategic approach to philanthropy." "What kind of focus did you have in mind?" "Healthcare access for underserved populations. I've been learning about treatment disparities, and I think our combined resources could address some critical gaps." We spent the next 3 months developing the Whitman Chin Health Equity Initiative, a $10 million fund that would provide both direct patient support and systemic healthcare improvements. Eleanor's social network provided political connections and community access, while my foundation's infrastructure handled program management and impact measurement. The initiative's launch event drew over 500 attendees, including elected officials, medical leaders, and philanthropic organizations from across the region. Eleanor's introductory speech highlighted the importance of combining traditional community engagement with innovative funding strategies. When she introduced me as her partner in developing the initiative, the applause was genuine rather than obligatory. The woman who'd once dismissed me as socially inadequate now presented me as an essential collaborator in addressing community challenges. "Mrs. Chen brings both strategic vision and operational excellence to this initiative," Eleanor told the audience. "Her foundation's track record demonstrates that philanthropic resources can create lasting change when managed with proper accountability and community focus." Later that evening, as we watched guests mingle and discuss potential collaborations, Eleanor reflected on the transformation our relationship had undergone. "You know, I spent so many years protecting what I thought was important that I nearly missed recognizing what actually mattered." Which was, that family isn't about maintaining traditions or social positions. It's about supporting each other's efforts to contribute something meaningful to the world. I smiled, thinking about the journey we traveled from that first hostile conversation to our current partnership. Sometimes the best outcomes come from the most unexpected beginnings. Indeed. Though I still think you should have told me sooner about the foundation's scope. We could have been collaborating years earlier. I tried several times, but you weren't ready to hear it then. And now you ask questions instead of making assumptions. That makes all the difference. The Whitman Chin Health Equity Initiative has since expanded into a $50 million program that serves as a model for other communities. Eleanor and I co-chair the board, combining her decades of nonprofit governance experience with my strategic philanthropy background. But more importantly, we've built a relationship based on genuine respect and shared commitment to creating positive change. The mother-in-law, who once told me I'd never fit into her family, now introduces me as her most valued collaborator in making that family's legacy more meaningful than either of us could have achieved alone. Success isn't just about having resources. It's about using those resources in ways that create lasting positive impact and building relationships strong enough to multiply that impact over time. Sometimes that means making dramatic gestures at charity galas. More often, it means patiently demonstrating your values until others are ready to recognize and respect them.